Hi, Scott. How are you doing?
I'm doing awesome. How about yourself? It's good to be here.
I'm really good. I'm really happy that we had the chance to do this again because last time, this is a bit of backstage for people who are listening to us. I had a problem with my connection, so we couldn't record, but I'm happy that you found the time to talk again. So thank you very much for being here.
Oh, of course. Glad to do it. Glad we can make it happen.
So I'm really interested to get talking with you about many things. There are lots of topics that I'm curious about, and I would like to start with a little bit of an introduction of yourself, of your path and what you did up until now.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess I'll start with what I do now, and then we can work backwards from there. So I'm the founder and chief sales geek at Sales Qualia. So we're a company that focuses on helping early stage B2B startups to ramp up and scale up their sales process. What we find is that, there's a lot of startups out there that come up with great products and they get their first few customers, they get some revenue in the door, but the founders of those companies often struggle when it comes to starting to build repeatability and scalability into their sales process. And so trying to make that jump from your first 10 customers to $1 million in annual recurring revenue, and then making the jump from 1 to 3 and 3 to 10, those are all really big jumps for early stage companies. And our job is to help them build the repeatable process they need in order to get to the growth path that they want to get to. So
amazing.
Yeah.
And how did you get there? What was the path before?
Yeah, so the path before, so I've been doing enterprise sales for about 25 years, basically out of college. I started doing sales worked with a company called Pearson Education, which back then when I was a sales rep, it was called Prentice Hall. And my first kind of real job out of college was selling college textbooks. So I would go to universities and talk to professors about the courses they would be teaching, and then talk to them about the textbooks that we were publishing at Prentice Hall and why they should be using those in their classroom. And so that really kicked off my journey that eventually got me out to Silicon Valley, because after 5 years at Prentice Hall, I was recruited to work with a early stage education technology startup called Applia. So Applia basically recruited me. I moved out to Silicon Valley in late 2001, early 2002. And since then, I was the head of sales for 3 different B2B startups, helped all 3 of those companies grow from virtually zero revenue to the first couple million in revenue. And now over the course of the last 5 years, I've been focusing on the work we do here at Sales Quality to help other companies like that achieve the same growth that I was able to help 3 B2B startups get as a head of sales.
Interesting. And if you were to look back on your career and point out the 1 or 2 moments which you think were really crucial into taking you where you are now, which ones would you point out?
Yeah, so I think the first moment was the decision to move to Silicon Valley. So I was traveling when I was with Prentice Hall. I would travel from the New York office to all over the country, and I would oftentimes come out to the San Francisco Bay Area. And every time, this is just for context for people listening, this is in the late 1990s with the first real internet boom, right? So you can imagine, here I am in New York City working for this kind of old world publishing company and flying out to San Francisco in the middle of this tech boom. So every time I came, I never wanted to leave. And I just kept telling myself, I got to be a part of this. And so I started working with a recruiter and said, look, I want to find an opportunity out in San Francisco. And so the recruiter found this opportunity with Applia, and just making that decision to move out to Silicon Valley, which at the time when I was living in New York, I thought, well, I'll move to the West Coast. I'll do the Silicon Valley startup thing for a couple of years, and then I'll move back to Manhattan. This is really, this is where life really is, like many East Coast people. And once I moved out here, I was just like, there's no way I'm ever leaving. So that was, 20 years ago. So that was the first, I think, decision. Yeah.
And why would you say that you got into sales? Like, what was the driver? Why are you interested? How did you come up with it?
I needed to get in sales because I needed to pay rent and I needed to eat. So
that's a great answer.
It wasn't by design, in that my undergraduate degree, I studied history. And for a little while, I was studying to also be a teacher. So my initial thought in college was like, I'll be a history teacher. I'll work at a high school. Maybe I'll coach soccer. That was kind of like how I was thinking about a career path. My mom happened to be a teacher as well. So I was kind of familiar with that life. And when I graduated college, I realized I really didn't want to teach. And if you're a history major, you don't really have a lot of options. You don't really have much of a quantitative background, so you can't, do anything on the financial side of business. You haven't studied marketing or business, so you can't really do anything on the marketing side. So what was left is like, go get a job in sales. I was always pretty good with people. I used to wait tables at a restaurant, and so I had a lot of experience just sort of interacting with people. And a friend of mine that was a couple of years older than me graduated college and got into sales, and he said, "Look, man, like it's a good job, and I think you'd be really good at it." So without any other real options, I just decided like, okay. So I started applying for sales jobs, and that's what got me into sales. I always thought, well, I'll do sales for a couple of years. I'll get my foot in the door like I did at Prentice Hall. I got promoted after a couple of years, and I'd become an acquisitions editor. I was doing a lot more product building, a lot more marketing work. And I thought, now I have a real job. Like now I don't have to do sales anymore. Now I've really worked my way into this big company. And then when the opportunity came up with Aplia to move out to the Bay Area, it was as the director of business development. And so that moved me back into sales. And from there, I just realized like, this is what I'm really good at. I really enjoy it. I like growing, taking this company from nothing in terms of revenue to getting those first customers, building out the entire team, getting to a place where you have repeatability and scalability. And from there, I just realized like, this is the path that I want to go.
Interesting. And what was the difference between really established, working in sales for a really established company or going to a Silicon Valley startup and seeing the process, starting up the process from nothing?
Yeah, I think, part of it was very similar in that, you have to know who your target customer is. You have to figure out what their problems are. You have to go out and do your prospecting. So the fundamentals of sales are pretty much the same. I think the biggest difference was when I was selling college textbooks, those professors, they knew what a textbook was. They knew what a textbook rep was supposed to do. I could go to their office, knock on the door, and they say, "Oh, you're the Prentice Hall textbook rep. Okay, I'll have a conversation with you." So it was just sort of a process that the buyer and the seller both kind of knew, right? When I moved into selling as a startup, what I realized is like, I'm selling a product that nobody else has built before. And it's solving a problem that professors have, but they don't know how this product could solve their problem. And so it was really a big shift in the selling, in that it was less about, hey, we have this book to help you with this class, to more about talking to them about what do they really want to achieve with their class? What's an ideal situation for the student? How can they be the best teacher that they want to be? And really understanding the outcomes that they want it for themselves, for their students, for the university. And then from there, showing how our product can help them get to that outcome. So while it's, when you're always selling, you should always be focused on problems. But in the traditional company, the sort of process of buying and selling was already established. Whereas with the startup, because there was no familiarity with the product and because it was brand new, and because technology itself was all new, this idea of doing online education, there was a lot of education that would go into the sales process itself.
Interesting. Yeah. And when you joined that first startup, was it before product market fit? Was it after? Did they already have a product? Did they already have some case studies maybe? Or was it just building everything from the ground up?
Yeah. So the company had built, I guess you'd probably call it an alpha version, maybe a beta version of the product. So they had, they had some working models of how the product should work. The founder of the company is a guy named Paul Romer. For people familiar with economics, Paul Romer just recently, I think it was 2 years ago, he actually ended up winning the Nobel Prize in economics.
Oh,
so which this is, again, going back to 2001, 2002. So even though he hadn't won the Nobel Prize yet, he was still a relatively well-known economist. Like, people knew his work, they knew his research. And that became kind of a way for us to get our foot in the door. We're like, hey, we're from Aplia. Our company's founded by Paul Romer. They didn't really pay attention to the Aplia piece, but when they heard Paul Romer, they're like, oh, Paul Romer. Or I know of that guy, right? So that kind of got the conversation started. And so really our first goal in that first few months that I was there was to find, 5 or 6 local universities that'd be willing to kind of use this beta version of the product almost as like a test case, as a pilot. And for us, it was really figuring out like, what does it actually take to get students to use this online software that we were building? And it was interesting because we realized like, wow, there's some technical hurdles because we had to get IT managers involved at the university. And like, why would you need to do that? Well, we had to get them to open up ports and allow security access. And how do students pay for this? Because they usually used to go into a bookstore and buying a book, and then they go to the cashier and give a credit card, and they're like, hey, this is how I pay for my books. Well, this is online. So how do they pay for these things? How do we actually collect money from students? These are all questions we hadn't really thought about until we went to implement. So that's kind of what we started with. And once we had those early proof, like those early test cases in the classroom that showed students were engaged and students were doing better in the class, then we could sort of, meanwhile, the product was continued to get built. Then at that point, after that first 3 to 6 months, then we could kind of go larger, go out to more universities and say, hey, we have these test cases. These are other professors just like you that are using it. This is what they're seeing. And from there, we could sort of kind of grow the go-to-market model from there.
Yeah, I understand. And what would you say was the hardest thing about that first experience inside a startup and scaling your first product?
Oh man, that's a good question. I think the hardest part was helping professors feel comfortable with this new product, this new medium. I mean, and I think this is a challenge for any startup, right? Because the professors that we talk to, even the ones you might consider an early adopter, they wanted to believe that this thing was going to work, but they were worried that, well, what if it doesn't work, right? And what if I have 50 students, or in some of the larger lecturers, they have 500 students as part of a principles of economics class. And if I send 500 students and I tell them you're going to buy this software, it's going to be online. Again, this is in 2002, 2003, online software in 2003, 2002. You're going to pay for this and you're going to do your homework every week using this software. If it doesn't work, it doesn't matter if I'm a tenured professor or not. Like, it's going to be damn embarrassing for me. I'm going to have to deal with 500 students like knocking on my door going like, I couldn't do my homework because the software doesn't work. And now I have to deal with that problem. Whereas if I tell my students, look, you're going to buy this textbook and you're going to read chapter 3. And then at the end of the chapter, do, the odd number of problems and turn them in for homework. That's easy. It's paper, it's pencil. I don't have to worry about students saying, oh, I don't know how to use a paper and pencil. I don't know how to buy a textbook. So the hardest thing really was getting professors comfortable with almost like taking a risk in their classroom. And that's where it's important to have early adopters, people that can see that the risk that they're taking is worth it because the outcome is going to be so much better for them as a teacher and for the students and their learning.
Well, to be honest with you, it sounds like a product that would be hard to sell even here in Italy in 2021. So I can only imagine what it would be like in 2002. So really interesting. And what was the second product that you sold? Was it in any way correlated with the education sector, or was it?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't at all. So after I was at Applia for a couple of years, I became so interested in economics because that was the core of our product offering was around economics courses. And because I was working with Paul Romer, I decided to leave the company to go back and get a master's degree in economics. So I actually left school, went back and got a master's in economics degree. And through that work, I opened up a consulting company where I was working with some international companies and helping them get funding for their projects. And I did that on my own. It was sort of like my first venture into doing something on my own as an entrepreneur. I did that for 2 or 3 years. It just never really got off the ground. I was back then still like my early 30s, still trying to like figure out what business was all about. So that kind of sputtered along for a couple of years. And then I decided, you know what, maybe this consulting operation that I'm trying to do isn't really working out. So that's where I dove back into Silicon Valley. I said, well, look, I love software. I'm good at that. I'm good at sales. And this is now 2007, right? And this is after like the initial crash, and now things are picking up again. And there's sort of like the second wave of technology startups. And so I met a founder of a company called Altos Research, which is a real estate data company. I met the founder, a guy named Mike Simonson, at a conference, and we just started chatting and got along really well. We met for coffee a few times, and he said, look, it was him and 2 co-founders. His 2 other co-founders were the technical people. both with full-time jobs one at Motorola, or actually both were at Motorola. And he was basically like Lone Ranger out there trying to sell the product. And he had gotten some customers and he got some traction, but really didn't have the sales acumen that I had from having done it in the past.
Yeah.
And that's where I joined the company as effectively a co-founder, and really helped build that company from a couple $100,000 in revenue to a couple million in revenue over the next 5 years. So that was real estate data as opposed to education technology.
Yeah, but I'm curious about the choice of going back to studying and going back to university. What was going through in your mind at that time? What were you thinking, and why did you choose that? I'm really curious about that.
Well, I mean, a couple of reasons. That's a great question. Not a lot of people have asked me that. For one, earlier I had gotten an MBA from Fuqua School of Business at Duke University, and I'd taken some economics courses in undergrad. I'd taken a couple of economics courses as part of my MBA. And I just always sort of enjoyed that. It seemed like that was a topic that seemed to click pretty well for me. I sort of understood supply and demand and the graphs. Some people struggle with that. For some reason, it kind of made sense to me. And then when I started working with Paul Romer and started going to all these different conferences and just seeing the research papers and talking to professors every day, I just became interested with the topic. And I thought, well, why don't I just go back and get an economics degree? That's going to open up other fields for me. So again, it was this idea like, well, maybe I did the startup thing for a couple of years. Like I said, I was going to do. I moved from New York up to Silicon Valley, did that for a couple of years. So maybe that part of my life, I can check the box and move on to the next part of my life. And coming out of my degree, I thought, well, I ended up doing some consulting, but I thought, well, maybe I could get a job working for a financial firm like a Morgan Stanley, or, maybe even work on the trading desk, make tons of money selling securities and those kinds of things. But ultimately, I think what I found is that there weren't the opportunities there that I wanted to do. I interviewed with some venture capital companies as well, doing some VC work. But again, it just wasn't, the same kind of level of enthusiasm that I had when I start talking to somebody about their tech startup. And so for me, it was just the draw. It almost like drew me back in. I thought I was going to break away from, again, doing sales and doing tech startups and maybe move into the financial market a bit. Maybe do venture capital because that's still related to startups without doing the tech. But ultimately, I think I just enjoyed this idea of building something from almost nothing and being the engineer of that sales process. And I'd done it with Applia and was able to do it again with Altos. And so it's just something I guess I'm just pretty good at. So
that's a really good answer. So thank you for that. I think it's a really great way for figuring out many things, trying many things so that you can figure out what you really like. And I like how even after you found something, you went to try something else again and then came back to it, which I think it's a choice that takes a lot of courage in every step of the way. So thank you for sharing that.
I appreciate that. I mean, there was some. It was a little bit of in some ways, leaving Applia to go get the economics degree, in some ways it was actually a pretty easy decision because it was something I really wanted to do. But financially and from a lifestyle standpoint, it was pretty hard.
Yeah.
Right? Because now I'm taking out student loans to pay for school. I moved on campus in this little dorm, and now I'm like a 30-year-old guy living on campus because it was the cheapest way to live. I didn't have, when I was working at Applia, even though it was a startup, I had a pretty decent salary. I was making $100,000 a year with bonuses and stuff. So when you're 28, 29, you're making $90K. This is 20 years ago in San Francisco. I was like, that's a pretty good life, Yeah. And to go from that into like living in a dorm and, eating frozen burritos again. And like, okay, why am I doing this? Like, what am I giving up when I could be in the workforce? So, and that part of it was a little bit tough. But I'm really glad I made that decision because it opened up different opportunities for me, and ultimately ended up meeting my wife at the same master's program. So everything else in my life was gotten even that much better because of that decision. So
amazing. And now I'm curious. Now that you've seen so many companies through the same process of going from a couple of clients to actually scaling, and you said something that really stuck with me, which is getting to predictability. I'm curious about what is the playbook there? How does it work? How do you go from here being small, 10 clients, not organized, to being huge and being able to triple your revenue every year?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think if you think about the journey of any entrepreneur, I always describe it as going from idea to impact. So every entrepreneur starts with like, hey, I got this idea. Maybe it's a problem that you see in the industry where you're spending a lot of time, where you're working now. Maybe it's like personal problem that you're solving. Like at Altos Research, the founder of that company started the company because he was trying to get real-time real estate data and he couldn't find any. He's like, oh, well, I'm just going to start scraping these websites and putting together a spreadsheet for myself. That's how he started the company, out of personal need. Regardless of why you start that company, it always starts with an idea, but where I think most, especially tech entrepreneurs, want to get to is a place where they're making real impact, changing a marketplace, changing how people operate, solving big problems. And so there's these steps along the way, these phases of growth. Not all startups are the same, right? So the first phase is kind of the true startup phase. It's the hustle and hard work where you're getting your first product out to market, your MVP, you're doing everything you can, working late at night at the kitchen table. You probably even still have a full-time job. You're doing this part-time. You're leveraging network, leveraging friends, doing anything you can to get those first 10 or so customers. You just want to prove, like, I found a problem and I built a product. So before you get to product market fit, you have to get to product problem fit. And that's where I think a lot of passion and enthusiasm in finding those first few customers is actually something that most founders, it's almost like it's a rite of passage. Like if you're not willing to go and do that hustle and hard work, you just can't be an entrepreneur, regardless if you're on sales, right? But then you get to that place and now you've got maybe 5 or 10 customers and they're paying you, and maybe they're not paying you what you'd like them to pay you, but you're starting to get a feel for, okay, we know who has this problem and we know how to solve that with our product. And now the next trick is to get out of the hustle phase. Oftentimes we talk about hustle as being this badge of honor with an entrepreneur. And yes, it's important, but there's also a place where you have to figure out where to grow out of hustle. And usually it's that place after those first 5 or 10 customers where you start to figure out, okay, these are the places where I can go get some more leads. If I spend some time on LinkedIn sending connection requests, those can turn into conversations, and those conversations can turn into sales leads. Or if I run a webinar and I spend 30 minutes teaching people about the problem that we solve, like people will get attracted to that education opportunity, and those will turn into sales opportunities for me. And so thinking about those systems, like it's the first form of a system around lead generation. And then you have those sales opportunities and you think, okay, now I have some predictability. Like I know once I get a lead, I know I need to talk to a director of marketing and I need to talk to the head of IT and I probably have to talk to the CFO. Now I know those are the 3 people I have to talk to in order to get the sale. That becomes part of that predictability. And so you start building out that sort of first version of your sales process. And when I talk about getting out of hustle and more into systems, that's where you have to start thinking through, well, how do I do this in a more repeatable way so that I'm not like hustling to get the next customer and then implementing with that customer. And while I'm implementing now I'm starving myself for future customers. And so that's sort of that ramp up phase. And then finally, now you have those complete systems. You know how to get leads, you know how to convert deals, you know how to price, you know how to support. That's where then you hire that full sales team to then help you scale. So we think of it as like startup, scale up.
Okay, interesting. For a founder, it's like the shift from working inside the business to working on the business.
Exactly.
Okay,
exactly.
Yeah. And I'm curious about. I said I'm curious and interesting so many times in this conversation, but it's actually because I'm curious and it's interesting. So
let's keep it going. Genuine. It's fun.
Yeah. You have seen so many startups, and the thing that catches my curiosity is, what are the common traits of great founders that you have seen in B2B startups?
Number one is they are willing to sell. So if like any founder that's going to be successful, they have to look at, at some point, right, you can spend a lot of time product building and build an MVP and test it and even give it away for free. At some point, you have to ask people for money. And the great entrepreneurs out there are people that are great salespeople, and they're going to be the best salesperson in their company. And even if they realize like maybe I'm not going to be a great salesperson, but it's necessary for me to be a salesperson. Too often where I've seen founders fail is where they're like, oh, I built this product. I just need to find somebody that can do the selling for me. And selling is
Yeah.
not something you can outsource. Just like you wouldn't say, I got this great idea for a product. I'm just going to find somebody to build the product for me. You could do that, but chances are the product that gets built is not going to be the same as the product that you want to build. So I think the number one trait of great entrepreneurs is people that accept and are willing to go out there and sell. The third startup I did was a company called Blend, which is lending software in the mortgage space. And our founder, guy Nima Gamsari, who's still there as a CEO, it's now a $4 billion company valuation. And like he would get on an airplane anytime, anywhere, talk to anybody. Like he and I were true partners on the sales process as much as I was leading sales. He was a CEO and he would come to meetings and he would lead meetings and he would talk to CEOs. He would get on an airplane in the morning, fly halfway across the country, do a 1 hour meeting, and then fly back and be back in the office in the afternoon. And he just accepted like he needed to be the best cheerleader and the person that was leading the charge out there every single day.
Yeah.
And that's the single biggest trait, at least from my perspective, of an entrepreneur.
Do you usually work with more technical or non-technical founders?
We work with both. I mean, oftentimes founders tend to be technical, right? Because if you're going to be the person that's going to act on, a problem that you find in the marketplace, you might tinker around and build that first version of your product on your own, or you might have a co-founder who's a CTO, a CTO kind of person that might do the building. So, but regardless, you're probably more of an engineering or product-based person. So I think the bigger challenge is more of that most company founders face, and that's where we come in, is they get those early customers, they do the hustle, they do the hard work, they get that first revenue in the door. But when it comes to getting those repeatable systems, they don't really know how to do lead generation on a repeatable way. They don't really think through what are the repeatable systems to get a deal from qualified through to convert it.
Yeah. I want to shift a little bit towards young people, let's say a 20-year-old who wants to be an entrepreneur. What would be your advice for a person like that?
Yeah, I was thinking about this question because you mentioned you might ask it, and there's two ways I've thought about this. So the first idea is like I didn't really while I tried this consulting company back in my early 30s, I don't know if I really consider that like a true foray into being an entrepreneur. It wasn't until I was doing this company, in my late 30s, early 40s before I officially made this my full-time work. And so part of me looking back on my 20-year-old self, if I was 26 or 27, part of me would like to go back and tell that person, like, look, man, you don't have to go work at some big company like you did at Pearson, or you can go work at a startup, but you could also just go do your own thing, carve your own path. It's okay. And that's something I try to, I have a 9-year-old son, and I want him to know he doesn't have to wait till he's 40 to start a company. So one piece of advice I would tell myself is like, go do your own thing, give it a try. It's okay if you fail, but at least give it a try so you don't get too long into the career path. Because when I did decide to make sales quality my full-time work, that was difficult from just a pure life standpoint, right? My wife was working on her PhD at UC Davis. We had a 2-year-old son at home. We had a mortgage. Like, we needed health insurance. Like, it's hard to like unwind all of the things that you need. It wasn't like I'm going to wake up on Tuesday and start a company. When I decided to leave Blend to do sales quality full time, it was like a 10-month transition that she and I talked it through, and how are we going to make this work, and how are we going to pay the bills, and what about Benjamin if he gets, how are we going to manage with health insurance? So it's harder to start when you're older because you just have more life piled on top of you in most cases. So part of me would say start sooner. Now, on the other hand, when I look back on my experience at Prentice Hall, selling textbooks, becoming a product manager, learning how to run a P&L, a profit and loss, being responsible for budgets, being responsible for production, working with different teams across the company, then moving to Silicon Valley and working at 3 different startups and seeing, as even an early stage employee, I wasn't the founder, but I could observe what it takes to grow a startup. There's an enormous amount of learning that's helped me be a better entrepreneur today. So what to that other part of my advice would be, it's cool to go work at companies, see how companies operate, and look at them with a critical eye. Figure out what you can learn from the people around you. Create those relationships and those mentorships. Because if you wait a little longer, sometimes that you'll be starting from a much higher base of knowledge, because you will have observed the right and wrong practices, as opposed to if you do it when you're 23, 24, you're going to be doing a lot of learning as you go. So I don't know if there's a right or wrong path, but it's either way is okay, as long as I think you consider the pros and cons of each of those for yourself.
Yeah, talking from personal experience, I can say that it's really hard to, let's say, consider both the options and weighting the two options and trying to figure out which one is the best. I want to move on to what I think will be my last question, and I'm really curious about what your answer will be, because if I gave you 30 seconds to talk with your past self, let's say before starting your first work experience or at any point in your life, what would be the main thing that you would tell yourself, the one thing that you think you should know before living your life the way you did?
Oh man, that's a big question. So is it like my high school self? Is it my 10-year-old self? Is it my...
I would say your just out of college self.
Just out of college self? I think the advice I would tell myself is be independent. Because it's like getting out of college, like I said, I'm like, I got to get a job in sales. And then I got a job in sales and I was working in Prentice Hall, and I got into the corporate structure a little bit. And I felt like I had to follow that career path from sales and get into product development. And, regardless of, whether it's work self or personal self, I've been in situations where I'm kind of like, you go with the flow a little bit too much. And, instead of, if I didn't really want to go out on a Saturday night, but my friends really wanted to go out, it's hard to, with that peer pressure. So you have the career pressure and the peer pressure, the professional stuff, the personal stuff. And it's hard to be independent. And you tell that to my 9-year-old son. He's complaining about 2 kids in his group, in his reading group, like, they talk too much and they're a bad influence. That's good. I want him to see that. But the key is, like, is he following their lead, or is he being independent and making sure he's separating himself away? So I think it's just really hard for somebody that's 23, 22 years old to really make those independent choices and do the things that they feel like is best for them, because there's all of this career pressure and social pressure and personal pressure. But as I've gotten older, I've had the ability to be more independent. And that has been the most satisfying way to run my own life, is to not worry about what other people think, and within reason, right? I mean, you want to be morally sound. But just say, look, this is the thing I'm doing. This is the thing I enjoy doing. And people can accept me for who I am or not. And I'm okay with that one way or the other. But I can do that. I can say that now because I'm 46. But if I was telling somebody 23 that, it'd be a lot tougher for somebody to hear it.
Yeah, but it's really good advice, and I'm thankful that you told us that. Thank you very much. I mean, this was a lot of fun talking to you, and you gave me lots of things that I will be thinking about for the next few days. And I'm really happy that we had the chance to talk, and I hope that we can get the chance to talk more in the next few weeks.
Happy to be
available. Thank you very much
for your audience.
Thank you.
All right, Pietro.